Did Luke copy Josephus? Well, let's go through the best piece of evidence that Luke did. It's found in Acts chapter 21. Paul is preaching to a crowd in Jerusalem and is then arrested by a Roman tribune who will eventually take him before the procurator Felix, where Paul will stand trial. But before they get to Felix, Paul and the tribune, after his arrest, have a very strange conversation. In Acts 21, starting in verse 37, we read, quote, "Just as Paul was about to be brought into the barracks, he said to the tribune, 'May I say something to you?' The tribune replied, 'Do you know Greek? Then you're not the Egyptian who recently stirred up a revolt and led 4,000 assassins out into the wilderness,' end quote." Okay, I think you can agree with me, this is a peculiar conversation, but it's actually mostly historical. During this time, when Felix was the governor over Judea, there was in fact an Egyptian rebel who stirred up a revolt against Rome and led many men into the wilderness. So there is no issue with these details. But the issue lies with who the Egyptian led out into the wilderness. According to this verse in Acts, the Egyptian led out 4,000 assassins, and Luke uses a very technical word for these assassins, the word Sicarii. Now, assassins operated within crowded cities and had hidden blades, and they obviously didn't work in large groups nor outside the city. So the idea of taking 4,000 of them out into the desert is just bizarre. So why has Luke given us this strange image? To put the question succinctly, why has Luke combined the ideas of wilderness and the Egyptian, which are historically accurate, with the Sicarii? Well, many will claim that this is due to Luke's reliance on Josephus. So, because Luke copied Josephus, we have this strange combination of ideas. And in this video, we're going to be explaining how this happened and whether or not this argument is even valid. So let's now focus on Josephus. He was a Jewish historian who wrote in the late 1st century, around about the same time Luke is writing. And Josephus wrote two major works, the Jewish Wars in 75 AD and the Antiquities of the Jews in 93 AD. Let's focus on his early work, the Jewish Wars, where in Book 2, Chapter 13, Josephus recounts the reign of Felix, who we mentioned earlier as the man who Paul had his trial before. Felix was the Roman procurator of Judea from 52 to 60 AD. Now, in Book 2, Chapter 13 of Jewish Wars, Josephus writes about the reign of Felix, and he begins by saying that during his reign, Felix was constantly putting down Jewish revolts against Roman rule. We read, quote, "Over the rest of Judea, the Emperor Nero made Felix procurator. This Felix took Eleazar the arch-robber and many that were with him alive, when they had ravaged the country for 20 years together, and sent them to Rome. But as to the number of the robbers whom he caused to be crucified, and of those who were caught among them, and whom he brought to punishment, there were a multitude not to be enumerated," end quote. So here Josephus is saying that during the reign of Felix, there were so many rebellions and so many revolts that we actually can't number them. He goes on to talk about a group of assassins that arose in Jerusalem. And Josephus uses the same word Sicarii to refer to these assassins. So following straight on from what we previously read, quote, "When the country was purged of these, there sprang up another sort of robbers in Jerusalem, which were called Sicarii, who slew men in the daytime and in the midst of the city. This they did chiefly at the festivals, where they mingled themselves among the multitude and concealed daggers under their garments, with which they stabbed those that were their enemies. And when any fell down dead, the murderers became a part of those that had indignation against them, by which means they appeared persons of such reputation that they could by no means be discovered." End quote. Now, just to summarize that, all it's saying is that these assassins would stab people and murder them with hidden blades, and then mingle into the crowd so that no one would notice them. We continue to read that the first man that was slain by them was Jonathan the high priest, and feel free to pause to read the rest of this. Now, immediately after talking about the Sicarii, Josephus will go on to talk about another group separate from the Sicarii who also caused a lot of trouble during the reign of Felix. And these troublemakers kept leading people out into the wilderness, convincing the masses that there were prophets sent from God. We read, quote, "There was also another body of wicked men gotten together, not so impure in their actions, but more wicked in their intention, which laid waste the happy state of the city no less than did these murderers. These were such men as deceived and deluded the people under pretense of divine inspiration, but were for procuring innovations and changes of the government. So here, Josephus is telling us that these men pretended that God was speaking to them, but at the end of the day, they had political ambitions and wanted to get Rome out so they could rule the Jewish people. We continue to read. And these prevailed with the multitude to act like madmen, and went before them into the wilderness, as pretending that God would there show them the signals of liberty. But Felix thought that this procedure was to be the beginning of a revolt, so he sent some horsemen and footmen both armed, who destroyed a great number of them. Now Josephus will go on to speak about a specific false prophet who led people out into the wilderness. He doesn't give him a proper name, but simply refers to him as the Egyptian. We read, quote, "But there was an Egyptian false prophet that did the Jews more mischief than the former, for he was a cheat and pretended to be a prophet also, and got together 30,000 men that were deluded by him. These he led round about from the wilderness to the mount which was called the Mount of Olives, and was ready to break into Jerusalem by force from that place." We continue to read. But Felix prevented his attempt and met him with his Roman soldiers, while all the people assisted him in his attack upon them, insomuch that when it came to a battle, the Egyptian ran away. Can we just pause here for a moment? So when Felix gets all the Roman soldiers to attack the Egyptian actually runs away and was never caught. Now, this is important because it makes sense as to why the tribune thought that Paul was the Egyptian. Remember, the tribune asks Paul, "Are you the Egyptian?" Why did he think this? Well, the Egyptian was never caught. And the fact that Paul and the Egyptian both operated at the same time, and from the tribune's perspective, both are religious fanatics stirring up the masses. Okay, let's continue to read. The Egyptian ran away with a few others, while the greatest part of those that were with him were either destroyed or taken alive. But the rest of the multitude were dispersed, every one to their own homes, and there concealed themselves. End quote. Okay, so to review what we've just read, Josephus has mentioned the Sicarii, wilderness, and the Egyptian all in one passage, but he isn't describing one event. Rather, Josephus has freely chosen to mention these different events to describe the chaos of Felix's reign. Now, let's bring Luke back into the conversation, who in Acts chapter 21, verse 38, seems to combine these three elements into one story, which has led many scholars to believe that Luke read Josephus and accidentally combined all of these elements together, believing they were one event. As one author notes, quote, "It looks as if what Luke has the tribune say in Acts 21:38 is a muddled conflation of Jewish wars, in which Josephus first talks about the Sicarii, then the impostors who led people out into the desert, and then about the Egyptian." This point is also made by Steve Mason, a terrific scholar of Josephus, who may have actually discovered this connection. In his book, Josephus and the New Testament, he writes the following, quote, "Notice first that although Josephus does not make the Egyptians' followers Sicarii, he mentions both groups in the same breath. As we have seen, he discusses the Egyptian immediately after describing the daggermen. He continues to write. But this is clearly part of his literary artistry. How did Luke then come to associate the Egyptian incorrectly with the Sicarii? If he did so independently of Josephus, the coincidence is remarkable." End quote. Mason also makes special mention of this very specific word, Sicarii, that both Luke and Josephus use to refer to the assassins. He writes, quote, "It is even more remarkable because Sicarii is a Latin term for assassins. Josephus seems to have been the first to borrow this word and made it a technical term for the Jewish rebels in his Greek narrative." How then did Luke, who also writes in Greek, happen upon the word? That he derived it from a source is clear because he uses it casually without betraying any knowledge of its significance. It is easiest to suppose that he had some knowledge of Josephus and that he linked the Egyptian with the Sicarii because Josephus's account had done so. End quote. So now when we put all of this evidence together and return to our original question, did Luke copy Josephus? It all seems very convincing that he did. And I too, for the longest time, thought that this was a slam dunk argument until I made this video and read a lot more of Josephus. And now I actually don't think Luke copied Josephus. And in the next part of this video, we're going to be going through this evidence. But before we do so, if you're enjoying this video so far, please make sure you hit that like button, leave me a comment and subscribe. These things make a huge difference to the channel. And the people who really keep the lights on are my beautiful patrons. So please consider joining my Patreon community to get tons of exclusive behind the scenes content and to importantly, enable me to keep creating this content. Okay, that's enough begging for money. Let's now go through the evidence that Luke did not copy Josephus. So, as we said before, Josephus wrote two major works, the Jewish Wars in 75 AD and the Antiquities of the Jews in 93 AD. Now, we're going to now analyze the Antiquities of the Jews, his later work. In this work, he repeats much of what he wrote in the Jewish Wars. And in Book 20, Chapter 7, he again recounts the reign of Felix, describing it as a time of many revolts and people being constantly led out into the wilderness. We read in Antiquities of the Jews, quote, "And now these impostors and deceivers persuaded the multitude to follow them into the wilderness, and pretended that they would exhibit manifest wonders and signs that should be performed by the providence of God. And many that were prevailed on by them suffered the punishment of their folly. For Felix brought them back and then punished them." Josephus then goes on to speak about one of these specific prophets that led people out into the wilderness, the Egyptian. We continue to read, quote, "Moreover, there came out of Egypt about this time to Jerusalem one that said he was a prophet, and advised the multitude of the common people to go along with him to the Mount of Olives, as it was called, which lay over against the city, and at a distance of 5 furlongs. He said farther that he would show them from hence how at his command the walls of Jerusalem would fall down, and he promised them that he would procure them an entrance into the city through those walls when they were fallen down." So it seems that the Egyptian thought that just as the walls of Jericho fell down at Joshua's command, here the walls of Jerusalem would fall down at his. Now, in response to this, Felix attacks the Egyptian and his followers. We continue to read, quote, "Now when Felix was informed of these things, he ordered his soldiers to take their weapons and came against them with a great number of horsemen and footmen from Jerusalem, and he attacked the Egyptian and the people that were with him. He also slew 400 of them and took 200 alive. But the Egyptian himself escaped out of the fight." Can we stop here for a moment and again remind ourselves that this perfectly coheres with what we read in Acts chapter 21, where the tribune thought that Paul himself was the Egyptian. Again, this makes sense because the Egyptian was never caught. We continue to read, "But did not appear anymore. And again the robbers stirred up the people to make war with the Romans, and said they ought not to obey them at all. And when any persons would not comply with them, they set fire to their villages and plundered them." End quote. Now, after describing the reign of Felix, in chapter 8 of book 20, Josephus will go on to talk about the next procurator of Judea, Festus, who Paul also had a trial before. Festus was the Roman procurator of Judea between 60 and 62 AD. In describing his reign, Josephus begins by talking about the Sicarii. He writes the following, quote, "Upon Festus's coming into Judea, it happened that Judea was afflicted by the robbers, while all the villages were set on fire and plundered by them. And then it was that the Sicarii, as they were called, who were robbers, grew numerous. They made use of small swords, not much different in length from the Persian akinia, but somewhat crooked, and like the Roman sickle or sickles, as they were called, and from these weapons these robbers got their denomination." End quote. Now, what Josephus has written here, I believe, is of immense importance. What I believe he is saying is that the people of Jerusalem at this time referred to these assassins themselves as Sicarii. This was a common word that the people of Jerusalem in the first century used to refer to these people. So this brings me to my first claim. And again, this is simply my claim. You need to be the judge of it, and we'll see what people think. Here is my claim. First, Josephus was not the first to borrow the word Sicarii from Latin. Rather, it was a common loan word that people used in the first century Judea. Therefore, it is reasonable that Luke knew the word independent of Josephus. So again, what I'm saying here is just like today, people will use loan words like cafe or kindergarten. Well, in the first century Judea, people borrowed the Latin Sicarii to refer to these assassins. We do not need to surmise that Luke was dependent on Josephus for the use of this word. I believe that's a very good argument based on what Josephus has written here. But let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and let's keep on reading so we can get to my second claim. So we next read, "For they mingled themselves among the multitude at their festivals, when they would come up in crowds from all parts to the city to worship God, as we said before, and easily slew those that they had a mind to slay." We continue to read, "They also came frequently upon the villages belonging to their enemies with their weapons and plundered them and set them on fire." Can we pause here for a moment? It seems, based on what Josephus has written here, that the Sicarii did not simply operate within cities. Here, we're told they also operated on the outskirts of cities in the villages. And this becomes even more persuasive as we come to the final part of Josephus here, which he writes, quote, "So Festus sent forces, both horsemen and footmen, to fall upon those that had been seduced by a certain impostor who promised them deliverance and freedom from the miseries they were under, if they would but follow him as far as the wilderness. Accordingly, those forces that were sent destroyed both him that had deluded them and those that were his followers also." End quote. Now, this is of extreme importance. Here, we are told that the Sicarii were led out into the wilderness. Now, they weren't led out by the Egyptian. Remember, the Egyptian operated during the reign of the previous procurator, Felix. Here, we're under the reign of Festus, and this person is simply called a certain impostor. But this is of extreme importance because what we have here is Josephus linking together these three ideas. The Sicarii were, in fact, led out into the wilderness by a certain impostor. So the idea that lots of Sicarii went out into the wilderness at the command of a man is not ludicrous. Josephus said it indeed happened. So let's bring Luke back into the conversation now, and I'm going to be making my second claim. And again, you can be the judge of this claim. My second claim is this: it is reasonable to believe that the Egyptian led Sicarii out into the wilderness, considering another rebel during the reign of Festus did the same thing. And now finally, to conclude this video, let's again return to our original question. Did Luke copy Josephus? And I say no to this statement. Now, I'm only basing this off our investigation of the Egyptian. There's still so much more we need to go through. For instance, people are going to claim that Luke copied Josephus about Theudas and Judas the Galilean, other rebels Josephus mentions. Also, Quirinius' census. Also, Lysanias of Abilene and the death of Agrippa, and so much more. So, if you've enjoyed this very thorough treatment of the Egyptian and want me to cover these other topics as well, please consider hitting that like button, leaving me a comment, and subscribing. These things make a huge difference, and it lets me know that people enjoy this type of content. And of course, if you really want to support my work and keep the lights on, please consider becoming a patron. Patrons get tons of exclusive content, and they truly keep this channel going. Thanks so much for watching the video until the end, and as always, I'll see you in the next one.